My daughter-in-law called my wife of 47 years finally gone at her memorial service. While I stood there grieving, she was already asking about antiques and inheritance papers. 3 days later, she discovered that Dorothy's precious collection wouldn't be going to her after all. Her reaction was explosive, but that was only the beginning of what she had coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed steadily against the stained glass windows of Laurelhurst Presbyterian Church as I adjusted my black tie for the third time in 10 minutes. Dorothy had always loved rainy days, said they made the world feel clean and new. Today, the weather seemed fitting for washing away 47 years of marriage, 47 years of shared coffee cups and garden projects, and quiet Sunday mornings reading newspapers side by side. I clutched the memorial program in my trembling hands, Dorothy's radiant smile beaming from the cover photograph we'd taken last spring in her beloved rose garden. She looked so alive in that picture, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes sparkling with the same mischief that had captivated me at a library fundraiser in 1976. The woman in that photo bore little resemblance to the frail figure who'd passed peacefully in her sleep just 4 days ago, but her spirit shone through unchanged. People were arriving steadily despite the downpour, shaking off umbrellas and speaking in hushed tones about Dorothy's decades of service as head librarian at Multnomah County Library. Her former colleagues came first, gray-haired women and men who remembered her passion for connecting children with their first favorite books. Then came neighbors from our Laurelhurst street, people who'd watched Dorothy tend her roses for decades and borrowed her hedge clippers more times than they could count. My son Michael arrived 20 minutes before the service, his wife Jessica trailing behind him with an expression I couldn't quite read. She wore an expensive black dress that looked more suited for a cocktail party than a memorial service, her designer heels clicking impatiently against the old wooden floors. Michael looked genuinely sorrowful, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that reminded me of the little boy who used to cry when Dorothy read him sad stories. "Dad," he said, embracing me with the awkward stiffness that had characterized our relationship since he'd moved to San Francisco 5 years ago. "I'm so sorry. I know how much Mom meant to you." Jessica stood beside him, checking her phone with barely concealed impatience. She offered me a brief hug that felt like a business transaction, her perfume sharp and overwhelming compared to Dorothy's gentle lavender scent that still lingered on my clothes. "Where should we sit?" she asked, scanning the filling sanctuary with calculating eyes. "Somewhere visible, right? People will expect to see family up front." The comment struck me as odd, but grief has a way of making everything feel slightly off-kilter. I guided them to the front row where Dorothy's sister Patricia was already seated with her son David. Patricia squeezed my hand as we sat down, her own eyes brimming with tears. "She looks beautiful," Patricia whispered, nodding toward the large portrait of Dorothy displayed beside an arrangement of white lilies and pink roses from our garden. "Just like she did when we were girls, always smiling, always optimistic about everything." The service began with Pastor Williams sharing stories about Dorothy's dedication to literacy programs and her volunteer work with reading groups for seniors. He spoke about her infectious laugh and her ability to recommend the perfect book for anyone who walked into her library. Dorothy had touched hundreds of lives through her work, and the sanctuary filled with gentle laughter as people remembered her kindness. But my attention kept drifting to Jessica, who seemed more interested in studying the other mourners than listening to the tributes. She whispered something to Michael that made him frown and shake his head.
When Dorothy's former assistant spoke about her mentor's patience with difficult patrons, Jessica actually rolled her eyes. The breaking point came during the reception in the church basement. I was accepting condolences from Dorothy's book club members when I overheard Jessica talking to another woman near the coffee table. Her voice carried that particular tone of false sympathy mixed with barely contained excitement. "It's so sad," Jessica was saying. But honestly, she's been declining for months. Harold couldn't see it, but the rest of us knew this was coming. In a way, it's a blessing that she's finally gone. She won't have to suffer anymore, and we can all move forward. Finally gone. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not at peace or free from pain, but finally gone. As if Dorothy's death was an inconvenience that had been resolved. I stood frozen, a coffee cup halfway to my lips, as Jessica continued her conversation with casual indifference. The house is lovely, isn't it? All those antiques Dorothy collected over the years must be worth quite a bit. And she always talked about wanting to help with our kids' college funds when we have them. Michael says his mother was very generous with family inheritance planning. College funds for children they didn't even have yet. Antiques she'd been appraising from across the room while I mourned my wife. The woman who'd spent years avoiding visits to Portland, who'd complained about Dorothy's old-fashioned cooking and boring stories about library work, was already calculating the value of our belongings. Patricia appeared beside me, her face pale with shock. "Harold, did you hear what she just said?" I nodded, unable to speak past the rage building in my chest. Jessica hadn't even waited until we'd buried Dorothy before starting her inheritance shopping. She'd stood in our church, accepted sympathy from Dorothy's friends, then dismissed 47 years of love and devotion as finally gone. Frank Rodriguez approached us, his weathered carpenter's hand steady as he placed one on my shoulder. Frank had worked with me for 30 years before we'd both retired, and he'd known Dorothy almost as long as I had. His presence brought a moment of calm to the storm building inside me. "That's your daughter-in-law?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Jessica, who was now examining the floral arrangements with what looked like professional appraisal. "Unfortunately," I managed. Frank studied Jessica for a moment, then looked back at me with the expression he'd worn on job sites when someone was about to make a costly mistake. "Dorothy leave a will?" "Everything's arranged. She was very specific about her wishes." "Good," Frank said firmly. "Sometimes people show their true colors when money's involved. Dorothy was smart to plan ahead." Jessica's voice rose slightly as she continued her conversation with the unfortunate woman she'd cornered. "The timing is actually perfect for us. We're looking at expanding our San Francisco condo, and Michael's been wanting to upgrade his car. Dorothy always said family should help family, and now she can finally do that, even after she's gone." Finally. That word again. As if Dorothy's death was a solution to Jessica's financial planning rather than the end of a beautiful life. I watched my daughter-in-law gesturing toward the memorial portrait with the same enthusiasm she might show discussing a profitable stock purchase. Patricia's grip tightened on my arm. "Harold, I've never seen anything so callous. How can Michael not see what kind of person he married?" Looking across the room, I could see Michael engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with Pastor Williams about Dorothy's volunteer legacy. He seemed genuinely moved by the stories people were sharing about his mother's impact on the community. The disconnect between Michael's grief and Jessica's opportunism was jarring. "She's not even trying to hide it," I whispered to Frank. "Dorothy's been dead 4 days and she's already spending the inheritance." "What inheritance?" Frank asked, his tone suddenly sharp. "I mean, what's she expecting to get?" The question caught me off guard because I realized I'd never discussed Dorothy's specific wishes with Michael or Jessica.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Dorothy had been very private about financial matters, preferring to handle everything through her lawyer without family involvement. She'd always said surprises were more meaningful than expectations. "Dorothy left very detailed instructions," I said slowly. "She spent months working with her attorney, making sure everything was exactly how she wanted it." Frank nodded approvingly. "Dorothy was always thorough. Remember when she organized that library fundraiser? Every detail planned months in advance, nothing left to chance. Across the room, Jessica had moved on to examining Dorothy's jewelry, the simple pearl necklace and wedding ring I'd placed in the memorial display. She was pointing them out to her new conversation partner, probably estimating their value while discussing Dorothy's generous spirit and family-first values. The hypocrisy was staggering. This was the same woman who'd visited Portland exactly 3 times in 5 years, who'd spent those visits complaining about our outdated house and Dorothy's repetitive stories about library patrons. She'd never shown the slightest interest in Dorothy as a person, but now she was practically conducting an estate sale in the church basement. Michael appeared at my elbow, looking embarrassed. "Dad, I'm sorry about Jessica. She's not handling grief well. She gets anxious about practical matters when she's upset." Anxious about practical matters. That was one way to describe grave robbing, I supposed. But Michael looked so genuinely distressed that I couldn't bring myself to shatter his illusions about his wife's character. Not here, not today, while Dorothy's memory still filled the room with warmth and love. "We should probably head home soon," Michael continued. "Jessica wants to help you start going through Mom's things. She thinks it might be therapeutic to begin organizing her collections." Organizing her collections? Dorothy had been dead less than a week, and Jessica wanted to start dividing up her treasures like party favors. The audacity was breathtaking, but also revealing. Jessica wasn't grieving a lost family member. She was claiming an inheritance she believed she'd earned simply by marrying into the family. "That's thoughtful of her," I managed, the lie tasting bitter. "But I'm not ready to disturb Dorothy's things yet. Everything can wait." Michael nodded understandingly, but I caught Jessica watching our conversation from across the room, her expression shifting from false sympathy to frustrated impatience. She'd clearly expected to begin her treasure hunt immediately, probably hoping to influence which items went where before I had time to think clearly. The memorial service was winding down, with people beginning to gather coats and umbrellas for the journey back into Portland's persistent drizzle. I stood by the door, shaking hands and accepting final condolences from Dorothy's friends and colleagues. Their stories about her kindness and wisdom were a balm to my wounded heart, reminding me of the woman I'd loved, rather than the commodity Jessica saw her as. But as the last guest departed, and I helped Patricia gather the memorial flowers, I couldn't shake the image of Jessica's calculating expression or the casual cruelty of her words. Finally gone. As if Dorothy's death was a business transaction that had finally cleared escrow. Frank lingered as we prepared to leave, his presence both comforting and knowing. "You gonna be okay tonight, Harry? House might feel pretty empty." "I'll manage," I said, though the thought of returning to our craftsman home without Dorothy's gentle presence felt overwhelming. Dorothy left me plenty to think about. "I bet she did," Frank replied, his tone carrying layers of meaning I was only beginning to understand. Dorothy was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. That's what made her such a good librarian and an even better judge of character. As we walked toward our cars, Jessica caught up with me one final time. "Harold, I know this is difficult, but we really should discuss Dorothy's estate planning soon. Michael and I want to make sure we honor her wishes properly, and some of those antiques might require special care or professional appraisal."
Professional appraisal. She wasn't even bothering with subtlety anymore. Dorothy's grandmother's china, her collection of first-edition books, her jewelry passed down through 3 generations, all of it reduced to line items on Jessica's mental balance sheet. "Dorothy's lawyer will contact everyone when it's time," I said firmly. She was very specific about how she wanted things handled. Something flickered across Jessica's face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern that her inheritance might not be as straightforward as she'd assumed. But she recovered quickly, flashing that practiced smile I'd seen her use with Michael's colleagues at work events. "Of course," she said. "I just want to help however I can. Dorothy meant so much to our family." Our family. The possessive pronoun felt wrong coming from someone who'd treated Dorothy like an inconvenient obligation for 5 years. But I simply nodded and climbed into my car, leaving Jessica standing in the church parking lot with rain beginning to darken her expensive dress. The drive home through familiar Portland streets felt like moving through a different world. Every corner held memories of Dorothy, the coffee shop where we'd had our first date, the bookstore where she'd worked part-time after retiring, the park where we'd walked every Sunday morning for 20 years. The city we'd shared was still there, but without Dorothy to share it with, everything felt distant and strange. Our Craftsman house sat quietly in the gathering dusk, its windows dark and welcoming. Dorothy's roses were blooming magnificently despite her absence, their fragrance greeting me as I walked up the front path. She'd planted most of them herself, spending hours researching varieties and soil conditions, determined to create something beautiful that would outlast both of us. Inside, silence pressed against my ears like cotton. No soft humming from the kitchen where Dorothy would prepare evening tea. No rustling of pages as she read in her favorite armchair. No gentle questions about my day or excited updates about library programs. Just silence and the echo of Jessica's words, finally gone. I wandered through rooms filled with 47 years of shared life, touching objects that held more memories than monetary value. Dorothy's reading glasses on the kitchen counter, folded beside a half-completed crossword puzzle. Her gardening gloves on the mudroom shelf, still holding the shape of hands that had planted every flower in our yard. Her favorite coffee mug and the dish drainer, waiting for a morning that would never come. But also waiting, I realized, was Dorothy's final gift to me. The detailed estate planning she'd completed just months before her death. She'd spent weeks with her attorney, making sure every aspect of her will reflected her values and her understanding of the people she'd loved. Dorothy had always been an excellent judge of character, and she'd had 5 years to observe Jessica's true nature. Finally gone, Jessica had said, as if Dorothy's death was a problem that had been solved. But Dorothy had never been the problem in our family. She'd been the solution, the steady presence who'd held everything together with quiet strength and boundless love. Her absence would reveal what kind of people we really were, and I suspected Jessica wasn't going to like what that mirror showed her. Tomorrow, Dorothy's lawyer would begin reading her will to the family. Jessica was expecting an inheritance that would fund her lifestyle, upgrades, and future plans. But Dorothy had been very specific about her wishes, very clear about which family members deserved her legacy, and which ones had already shown their true colors. I fell asleep in Dorothy's favorite armchair, surrounded by her books and the lingering scent of her lavender perfume, wondering if my daughter-in-law had any idea what kind of woman she'd underestimated.
Dorothy Mitchell had spent 40 years as a librarian, organizing information and understanding people's motivations better than they understood themselves. She'd been finally gone for less than a week, but her final lesson was just beginning. The morning after Dorothy's memorial service, I woke in her favorite armchair with a crick in my neck and the strange disorientation that comes from sleeping somewhere you don't belong. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains she'd sewn herself, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the quiet air. For a moment, I forgot why I was sleeping in the living room instead of our bedroom upstairs. Then, reality crashed back with the weight of fresh grief. Dorothy was gone, and Jessica's callous words from yesterday echoed in my mind like a persistent headache. Finally gone. The phrase had kept me awake most of the night, replaying alongside memories of other moments when Jessica's true character had shone through her polished facade. I made coffee using Dorothy's precise measurements, 2-level scoops of medium roast with just a splash of cream, and carried the steaming mug to the kitchen table where she'd left her final crossword puzzle half completed. Her handwriting filled the easy clues in neat cursive, but the difficult corners remained blank, waiting for a mind that would never return to solve them. The doorbell chimed at precisely 9 o'clock, and through the front window I could see Michael standing on the porch with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, his expression nervous and apologetic. He'd always been punctual, even as a child, arriving exactly when he said he would for everything from dinner to bedtime stories. "Morning, Dad," he said when I opened the door, offering the flowers with the awkward gesture of someone who wanted to help but didn't know how. "I brought these from Mom's garden. I thought maybe we could plant them where she used to sit and read." The thoughtfulness touched me deeply. These were the moments when I could see Dorothy's influence in our son,
her gentle nature shining through despite the complications his marriage had introduced to our family dynamic. "She would have loved that," I said, accepting the flowers and stepping aside to let him enter. "Your mother always said gardens were for the living to enjoy, not just to look beautiful." Michael wandered through the house with the careful movements of someone revisiting a childhood home after years away. His fingers traced the spine of books Dorothy had recommended to him, paused at photographs of family vacations when he was young, lingered on the piano bench where she taught him to play simple melodies. "I keep expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen," he admitted, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "She always hummed when she was cooking, remember? Those old songs from when you two were dating?" I remembered. Dorothy's soft humming had been the soundtrack of our domestic life, filling quiet moments with melodies that spoke of contentment and love. She'd hummed while folding laundry, while reading student papers, while working in her garden. The house felt hollow without those gentle sounds. "Jessica wanted to come with me," Michael continued, settling into the chair where his mother used to sit for their weekly phone calls. "But she thought you might want some time with just family first. She's really torn up about Mom's death, you know. Sometimes she processes grief differently than we do." Differently was certainly one way to describe yesterday's performance. I wondered if Michael had heard his wife's inheritance calculations or if he'd been too absorbed in his own mourning to notice her appraising glances at our belongings. Either way, I wasn't ready to shatter his illusions about Jessica's motivations. "How is she handling everything?" I asked carefully, genuinely curious about what story Jessica was telling her husband about her behavior. Michael's face clouded with concern. "She's worried about you, actually. She thinks she might be overwhelmed by having to manage Mom's estate alone. She offered to help organize things, maybe contact some antique dealers to get proper valuations for insurance purposes." Antique dealers?
Insurance purposes. Jessica was already laying the groundwork for liquidating Dorothy's treasures, probably hoping to establish their monetary value before the will reading. The calculation behind her supposed grief was breathtaking. "That's thoughtful," I managed, "but Dorothy left very specific instructions about her belongings. Her lawyer will guide us through everything." Something shifted in Michael's expression, a flicker of surprise that suggested Jessica hadn't mentioned the possibility of detailed estate planning. "Mom worked with a lawyer? She never said anything about that to me." "Your mother was very private about financial matters. She preferred to handle things quietly, without causing family stress or expectations." This was absolutely true. Dorothy had always managed our household finances with quiet efficiency, paying bills and organizing investments without fanfare or discussion. She'd viewed money as a tool rather than a topic of conversation, useful for creating security and opportunities, but not worthy of obsessive attention. "Did she leave anything specific for Jessica and me?" Michael asked, his voice careful and slightly embarrassed. "I mean, I know it's too early to think about that, but Jessica mentioned that Mom had talked about helping with future grandchildren's education." There it was. Jessica had been planting seeds in Michael's mind, preparing him to expect an inheritance that would fund their lifestyle and hypothetical children's futures. She'd probably framed it as Dorothy's own wishes, making herself seem selfless while positioning herself to receive maximum benefit. "Your mother had very definite ideas about family and responsibility," I said, choosing my words carefully. "She spent months making sure her will reflected her values and her understanding of the people she loved." Michael nodded, seemingly satisfied with this diplomatic non-answer, but I could see him processing the implications, probably wondering why Dorothy hadn't discussed her plans with him directly. The truth was that Dorothy had discussed her plans extensively, just not with Michael or Jessica. She'd spent hours talking to me about her observations of Jessica's character, her concerns about our daughter-in-law's motivations, and her desire to ensure her legacy went to people who would truly appreciate its meaning rather than just its monetary value. Dorothy had been hurt by Jessica's dismissive attitude toward her stories, her impatience with family traditions, her obvious boredom during visits to Portland. "She noticed everything, didn't she?" Michael said, suddenly. his gaze moving to a photograph of Dorothy with her library colleagues. Mom always paid attention to details other people missed. She did, I agreed. Your mother understood people better than they understood themselves sometimes. It made her an excellent librarian and an even better judge of character. Michael was quiet for several minutes, studying the room as if seeing it through his mother's eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to question things he'd previously accepted without thought. "Dad, can I ask you something? And please be honest with me." I nodded, though I had a feeling this conversation was about to become more difficult than either of us wanted. "Did Mom ever say anything about Jessica? I mean, did she have any concerns about our marriage or how Jessica treated her?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to ignore, but dangerous to address directly. "Your mother loved you deeply," I said carefully. "She wanted you to be happy, and she tried very hard to build a good relationship with Jessica." "That's not what I asked, Dad. Did she have concerns?" The directness in his voice reminded me of Dorothy when she was pressing library patrons to be honest about overdue books or incomplete research. Michael had inherited his mother's ability to cut through diplomatic evasion when truth mattered more than comfort.
Yes, I admitted. She did have concerns. Michael's shoulders sagged as if I'd confirmed something he'd been trying not to see. What kind of concerns? She felt that Jessica didn't understand family loyalty, that material things mattered more to her than relationships. Your mother spent her whole life believing that love showed itself through actions, through presence, through caring about people's stories and memories. She worried that Jessica saw family as a collection of obligations rather than opportunities for connection. The words felt both liberating and devastating to speak aloud. I'd been carrying Dorothy's observations for years, watching as she tried repeatedly to engage Jessica in meaningful conversation, only to be met with polite disinterest or barely concealed impatience. "She never said anything to me," Michael whispered. "She didn't want to hurt you or create conflict in your marriage. Your mother believed that people could grow and change, that maybe Jessica just needed more time to understand what family really meant. And now I think your mother's final wishes will speak for themselves." Michael sat in silence for a long time, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Outside, Portland's morning traffic hummed past our quiet street. People going about their daily routines while we wrestled with revelations that would reshape our understanding of family dynamics. "Jessica called me last night," Michael said finally. "She wanted to know if you'd mentioned anything about Mom's jewelry or her antique collection. She said she was worried that some items might be valuable enough to require special storage or insurance." Special storage, insurance. Every conversation with Jessica seemed to circle back to the monetary value of Dorothy's belongings. Never their sentimental worth or the stories behind them, just their potential contribution to Jessica's financial planning. "Did your mother ever tell you about her grandmother's china set?" I asked. Michael nodded. "She said it came from Germany, that it was one of the few things her family saved when they immigrated. Jessica suggested last month that we should sell it, said modern china was more practical and the old set just took up space in the dining room cabinet." The hurt that crossed Michael's face was immediate and raw. That china set had been the centerpiece of every holiday meal he could remember, every birthday celebration, every important family gathering. Dorothy had told him stories about each piece, how her grandmother had carefully packed it for the journey to America, how it had survived the Depression when other families were selling their treasures to buy food. "She said that about Grandma's china?" "She said a lot of things about your mother's belongings, Michael, always framed as helpful suggestions or practical concerns, but the message was always the same. Everything your mother treasured was outdated, inconvenient or better converted to cash. Michael's face cycled through emotions, from disbelief to recognition to something that looked like shame. I could see him remembering conversations, revisiting moments when he dismissed Jessica's comments as pragmatic thinking rather than recognizing them as attacks on his family's values and history. "I should have paid more attention," he said. "I should have stood up for Mom when Jessica made those comments. You couldn't have known." Jessica was always careful to make her criticisms seem reasonable, like she was trying to help us modernize or be more practical. It took your mother months to recognize the pattern.
The truth was settling over Michael like a heavy blanket, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. I watched him process years of interactions through this new lens, probably remembering moments when his wife's behavior had seemed slightly off, but he had attributed it to stress or different family backgrounds. "What happens now?" he asked. "When does Mom's lawyer read the will?" "Tomorrow afternoon. She'll meet with the family at her office downtown. Jessica will expect to be included in that meeting. Dorothy's will specifies exactly who should be present for the reading." Something in my tone must have warned him, because Michael's expression shifted from sadness to apprehension. "Dad, what did Mom do?" "She did what she always did. She thought carefully about every decision, considered all the people involved, and acted according to her values and her understanding of what was right." We spent the rest of the morning planting the flowers Michael had brought, working in Dorothy's garden while sharing memories of her patience with struggling students, her excitement about new book acquisitions, her gentle way of correcting mistakes without making people feel foolish. The physical work felt healing, connecting us to Dorothy's love of growing things and her belief that beauty required both planning and patience. When Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the front door with the expression of someone who'd realized an uncomfortable truth, but wasn't sure what to do about it. Should I prepare Jessica for the possibility that Mom's will might not be what she's expecting? I think Jessica should prepare herself for the possibility that your mother understood her better than she realized. Michael nodded slowly, then surprised me by wrapping me in a long, tight hug that reminded me of the affectionate child he'd been before life and marriage had complicated our relationship. "I'm sorry, Dad, for not seeing what Mom saw, for not protecting her from Jessica's comments, for not being a better son while I still could." "You were exactly the son your mother wanted you to be," I assured him. "She never doubted your love for her, Michael. She just worried about whether you'd be strong enough to see the truth when it mattered." After he left, I sat in Dorothy's garden, surrounded by the flowers we'd planted together, thinking about how she'd prepared for this moment with the same careful attention she'd brought to everything else in her life. Tomorrow, Jessica would discover that finally gone didn't mean finally available for exploitation. Dorothy had spent her entire career teaching people that knowledge was power, but wisdom was knowing how to use that power responsibly. Tomorrow's will reading would demonstrate both her knowledge of human nature and her wisdom in protecting the people and values she'd held dear. The afternoon sun warmed my face as I imagined Dorothy's quiet satisfaction at having the final word in a conversation Jessica thought she'd been controlling all along. Sometimes the meek really would inherit the earth, but they do it on their own terms and in their own time. Tomorrow would prove that underestimating a librarian's attention to detail had been Jessica's first and most costly mistake. Dorothy's attorney, Margaret Chen, had occupied the same corner office in downtown Portland for 23 years. Her law practice specialized in estate planning for middle-class families, and she'd earned a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and unwavering discretion. Dorothy had chosen her specifically because Margaret understood that family dynamics often revealed themselves most clearly when money was involved. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit for important appointments, and found Margaret arranging documents on her mahogany conference table with the precision of someone who'd conducted hundreds of similar meetings. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy suit projected the professional competence that it made Dorothy trust her with our family's most sensitive matters. "Harold," she greeted me with a warm handshake. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Dorothy was one of my favorite clients, not just because she was thorough, but because she truly understood that estate planning is about values, not just valuables."
She spent months working on this, didn't she? She did. We had 7 meetings over the past year, and she revised her will 3 times to make sure every detail reflected her intentions. Dorothy wanted to be absolutely certain that her legacy would go to people who would treasure it for the right reasons. The conference room door opened, and Michael entered with Jessica beside him. My daughter-in-law wore a black dress that managed to be both appropriate for the occasion and expensive enough to signal her expectations. Her makeup was perfect, her expression set in a mask of respectful grief that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, offering me a brief embrace that felt rehearsed, "I hope you're holding up well. These legal matters must be so overwhelming." Overwhelming. As if Dorothy's final wishes were bureaucratic burdens rather than her last opportunity to express love and judgment. Jessica's choice of words revealed her assumption that I was too grief-stricken to think clearly about financial decisions, probably hoping to position herself as a helpful voice of reason. Michael looked genuinely nervous, his hands fidgeting with his tie in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was anxious about test results or disciplinary meetings with teachers. He'd spoken to Jessica about our conversation yesterday, and I could see the weight of new understanding in his posture. Patricia arrived with David just as Margaret was preparing to begin. My sister-in-law's presence brought comfort and continuity, a link to Dorothy's family history that extended beyond my own grief. David, now 35 and a successful architect, had always been Dorothy's favorite nephew, sharing her love of books and her curiosity about how things were built, whether buildings or stories. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, settling behind her desk with Dorothy's will prominently displayed. Dorothy was very specific about who should be present for this reading, and she left detailed explanations for her decisions that I'll share as we proceed. Jessica shifted in her chair, her expression brightening with anticipation. She'd probably spent the morning researching the value of Dorothy's antique collection or calculating how much the house might be worth in Portland's inflated real estate market. The prospect of inheriting Dorothy's accumulations clearly excited her more than the loss of Dorothy herself had saddened her. "Before we begin with the specific bequests," Margaret continued, "Dorothy wanted me to read a letter she wrote to explain her thinking. She felt it was important for everyone to understand the principles that guided her decisions." The attorney opened a sealed envelope and extracted several pages of Dorothy's familiar handwriting, the same careful cursive that had filled decades of library reports and personal correspondence. Even seeing her words on paper brought her presence into the room, as if she were speaking to us directly from beyond her recent grave. "To my beloved family and friends," Margaret read aloud. "If you are hearing this letter, it means I am no longer able to speak these words myself, but I hope you will hear my voice in them nonetheless. I have spent considerable time thinking about how to distribute the possessions I accumulated during my 72 years, and I want you to understand that every decision reflects my deepest values and my honest assessment of the people I love." Jessica's smile faltered slightly, perhaps sensing something in Dorothy's tone that didn't align with her expectations. She glanced at Michael, who was staring at his hands with an expression of growing apprehension. Margaret continued reading Dorothy's words. "I have always believed that inheritance should reward character rather than mere relationship, that family loyalty must be demonstrated through actions rather than assumed through genetics. The people who receive my treasures have earned them through years of genuine love, consistent presence, and respect for the values that shaped my life." The conference room fell quiet, except for the distant sounds of Portland traffic filtering through Margaret's windows. Dorothy's message was becoming unmistakably clear, though Jessica seemed to be processing the implications more slowly than everyone else. "My husband Harold has been my partner in every sense of the word for 47 years. He supported my career when other men might have felt threatened, celebrated my successes as if they were his own, and cared for me during my final illness with a devotion that humbled me daily. To Harold, I leave our house and all its contents, my personal bank accounts, and my life insurance policy, knowing that he will use these resources wisely and with the same generosity he has shown me throughout our marriage. I felt tears threatening as Margaret read Dorothy's assessment of our life together. Even in death, Dorothy was defending and honoring our partnership, making sure the world understood what our marriage had meant to both of us. To my dear sister Patricia, who has been my closest friend since childhood and who never missed an important moment in my life, I leave my collection of first edition books and my grandmother's china set, knowing she will treasure their history and pass their stories to future generations who will appreciate their significance. Patricia gasped softly, her hand moving to cover her heart. The china set had been a centerpiece of every family gathering for decades, and Dorothy's book collection represented a lifetime of careful acquisition and loving preservation. To my nephew David, who has always shown genuine interest in family history and who took time from his busy career to visit an old aunt regularly, I leave my jewelry collection and a sum of $50,000 to help establish his daughter's education funds. David's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. He'd indeed visited Dorothy monthly, bringing his daughters to hear her stories and maintaining the kind of consistent relationship that Jessica had never bothered to cultivate. Jessica was beginning to look genuinely concerned now, her composed facade cracking as she realized that significant portions of Dorothy's estate were being distributed to other people. She'd clearly expected to be mentioned prominently by now, and the absence of her name from Dorothy's generous bequests was becoming impossible to ignore. To my son Michael, who has grown into a man I am proud to call mine, despite the challenges his marriage has presented, I leave my teaching awards, my diploma from Portland State University, and $25,000, hoping these will remind him of the values I tried to instill and the importance of choosing love over convenience in all his relationships. Michael's face went pale as Margaret read Dorothy's careful phrasing. The reference to challenges his marriage has presented was diplomatic but unmistakable. Dorothy's gentle way of acknowledging the difficulties Jessica had brought to our family dynamic without directly attacking her son's choice of partner. Jessica was no longer trying to hide her agitation. Her leg bounced nervously under the conference table, and she kept glancing between Margaret and the remaining pages of Dorothy's letter with growing alarm. The inheritance she'd been counting on was being distributed to everyone except her, and Dorothy's reasoning was becoming uncomfortably clear. Margaret turned to the final page of Dorothy's letter, and I could see Jessica holding her breath in desperate hope that she'd finally hear her name associated with some significant bequest. Instead, Dorothy's words delivered a masterpiece of diplomatic devastation. To Jessica, my daughter-in-law, I acknowledge the difficulty of joining an established family with its own traditions and ways of expressing love. I have observed your relationship with our family for 5 years, hoping to see signs that you understood the difference between material value and emotional worth.
Unfortunately, your actions have consistently demonstrated that you view our family's treasures as commodities rather than connections to our shared history. Jessica's face drained of color as Margaret continued reading Dorothy's assessment. Around the conference table, you could have heard a pin drop as my wife's final judgment unfolded in careful, measured sentences. I watched you suggest selling my grandmother's china because modern dishes were more practical. I heard you recommend converting my book collection to cash because digital reading was more convenient. I noticed your impatience when I tried to share the stories behind these objects, your dismissive attitude toward the memories they represented, your calculation of their monetary worth rather than their irreplaceable significance to our family's heritage. Each observation hit Jessica like a physical blow. Dorothy had indeed been watching, listening, and remembering every casual comment about outdated furniture,
every suggestion about practical modernization, every moment when Jessica had revealed her true priorities. Most painfully, I witnessed your behavior at my memorial service, where you discussed my death as if it were a business opportunity, and my lifelong accumulations as if they were assets awaiting distribution. Your comment that I was finally gone demonstrated a callousness that no amount of inheritance could excuse or enable. Jessica made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, as she realized Dorothy had somehow known about her memorial service comments. The careful mask of grief and respectability she'd worn for years was being stripped away by a dead woman's perfect memory and ruthless honesty. Margaret's voice remained steady and professional as she read Dorothy's final verdict. Therefore, to Jessica, I leave my copy of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, specifically the scene where Mr. Darcy observes that disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. I hope that someday you will understand that authentic relationships cannot be built on pretense and that love cannot be purchased or inherited, only earned through consistent demonstration of character and genuine care for others. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica stared at Margaret in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she processed the reality that Dorothy's entire estate would pass to other people. After 5 years of strategically positioning herself for inheritance, of enduring boring family visits and pretending interest in old woman stories, she would receive nothing but a pointed literary criticism wrapped in the form of a book. "That's it?" Jessica finally managed, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "A used book? After everything I did for that woman? All the time I spent listening to her rambling stories about dead people and dusty old objects, she leaves me a book?" The mask was fully off now, revealing exactly the person Dorothy had described in her letter. Jessica's reference to everything I did exposed her transactional view of family relationships, while her dismissal of Dorothy's stories as rambling about dead people demonstrated the contempt she'd always felt but carefully hidden. "Jessica," Michael said quietly, his face flushed with embarrassment and recognition, "please don't." "Don't what? Don't be honest about the fact that your mother just screwed us out of thousands of dollars? That house alone is worth $500,000, and she's giving it all to your father like we don't matter?" Margaret cleared her throat diplomatically. "I should mention that Dorothy also left a sealed letter specifically for Jessica to be opened only if she attended the will reading. Would you like me to retrieve it?" Jessica nodded eagerly, probably hoping for some private explanation or perhaps a secret bequest that would restore her financial expectations. Margaret withdrew a smaller envelope from her files and handed it across the table. Jessica tore it open with shaking hands and read silently, her expression shifting from hope to confusion to fury as she processed Dorothy's final personal message.
When she finished, she crumpled the letter and threw it on the conference table. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. She has the nerve to lecture me about family values from beyond the grave, while cutting me out of everything valuable. I reached for the crumpled letter, smoothing it carefully to read Dorothy's final words to the woman who'd spent 5 years trying to inherit her treasures while showing no interest in inheriting her values. "Dear Jessica," Dorothy had written, "if you are reading this, it means you attended my will reading despite having no genuine grief for my death. I hope you will use this disappointment as an opportunity for self-reflection about the difference between loving a person and coveting their possessions. True family wealth cannot be measured in dollars or distributed through legal documents. It exists only in the memories we create through genuine care for each other's well-being. Perhaps someday you will understand that the greatest inheritance I could have left you was the example of what authentic love looks like, though I fear you were too busy calculating monetary values to notice." The letter was vintage Dorothy, combining devastating honesty with hope for eventual redemption. Even in death, she was trying to teach, offering Jessica one final lesson about character and priorities, wrapped in the disappointment of thwarted greed. Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against Margaret's polished floor. "Michael, we're leaving.
I'm not going to sit here and be insulted by a dead woman who clearly had no appreciation for everything I sacrificed to be part of this family." But Michael remained seated, staring at his mother's letter with an expression of profound sadness and recognition. The scales had finally fallen from his eyes, and he was seeing his wife's character with the same clarity Dorothy had possessed for years. "What sacrifices, Jessica?" he asked quietly. "What exactly did you sacrifice? Because from what I can see, you spent 5 years treating my mother like an obstacle to your financial planning." The confrontation I'd been dreading was finally beginning, but it wasn't between Jessica and me. It was between Jessica and the truth she'd been avoiding, reflected in her husband's eyes and confirmed by his mother's devastating accuracy. The drive back from Margaret Chen's office happened in complete silence, with Jessica staring out the passenger window at Portland's gray afternoon while Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The tension in their rental car was suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm when everyone knows destruction is coming but nobody wants to acknowledge it. I followed them in my own vehicle, watching through my windshield as Jessica's shoulders shook with what appeared to be either rage or tears. Probably rage, given her explosive reaction to Dorothy's will and the complete absence of grief she'd shown for my wife's actual death. The woman who'd called Dorothy finally gone was now discovering that being gone didn't automatically translate into being generous. When we reached my house, Jessica erupted from the car before Michael had fully stopped, her designer heels clicking violently against the driveway as she stormed toward the front door. She stood there waiting with her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled fury mixed with what looked like desperate calculation. "We need to talk," she announced as I approached with my keys. "All of us, right now." Michael emerged from the car more slowly, his expression carrying the shell-shocked look of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been demolished. He'd spent 5 years making excuses for his wife's behavior, explaining away her casual cruelties as different communication styles or practical thinking. Now Dorothy's letter had spelled out exactly what Jessica really thought about his family, and there was no way to rationalize or reinterpret her true character.
Inside the house, Jessica began pacing around my living room like a caged animal, her movements sharp and agitated as she formulated whatever argument she believed might salvage her expectations. She kept glancing at Dorothy's antique furniture, her grandmother's china cabinet, the first edition books now destined for Patricia, as if memorizing what she'd lost. "This is insane," she began, her voice pitched higher than normal with stress and indignation. "Harold, you have to understand that Dorothy wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Grief affects people's judgment, makes them paranoid and suspicious of the people trying to help them." The audacity was breathtaking. Jessica was suggesting that Dorothy's perfectly lucid assessment of her character was actually evidence of mental illness, that 5 years of careful observation and documentation were somehow symptoms of grief-induced paranoia rather than accurate conclusions about Jessica's true nature. "Dorothy spent months working with her attorney," I replied calmly. "She was completely clear-headed and very specific about her reasoning. Margaret Chen confirmed that Dorothy understood exactly what she was doing." "Lawyers can be manipulated too," Jessica shot back. "Elderly people are vulnerable to suggestions, especially when they're dealing with terminal illness. I've read about cases where family members influence dying relatives to change their wills unfairly." She was grasping at straws now, trying to construct a narrative where Dorothy's devastating accuracy was actually evidence of outside manipulation. The implication that I had somehow brainwashed my dying wife into recognizing Jessica's greed was both insulting and ridiculous, but also revealing of how desperate Jessica had become. Michael finally spoke from where he'd been standing silent near the fireplace. "Jessica, stop. Just stop talking." "Stop talking? Michael, your father just stole our inheritance. That house alone is worth $500,000, not to mention all those antiques your mother collected. We were counting on that money for our future, for the kids we want to have, for the life we planned together." The life they'd planned together, funded by Dorothy's death, and built on the foundation of my wife's accumulated treasures. Jessica wasn't even pretending anymore that Dorothy's legacy had any meaning beyond its monetary value. In her mind, my wife had been a walking bank account that had maliciously closed itself just when Jessica needed a withdrawal. "You want to know what Mom really thought about you?" Michael asked, his voice deadly quiet. "She told Dad that you suggested selling her grandmother's china because modern dishes were more practical. That china survived the Depression, Jessica. It came from Germany with refugees who gave up everything else to bring their family history to America." Jessica's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger was impossible to determine. "That was just a practical suggestion. Those dishes were sitting in a cabinet gathering dust while more functional options were available. I was trying to help Dorothy be more efficient." "Efficient," Michael repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "You wanted to help my mother be more efficient by destroying 4 generations of family history." "It's just stuff, Michael. Objects, things. Your mother was obsessed with material possessions that serve no useful purpose in modern life." The irony was staggering. Jessica, who'd spent 5 years calculating the value of Dorothy's possessions and planning how to inherit them, was now dismissing those same objects as meaningless when she realized they wouldn't be hers. The woman who'd been mentally cataloging antiques at Dorothy's memorial service was suddenly advocating for minimalism when it became clear that minimalism wouldn't benefit her personally. I watched this exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, seeing Michael finally confront the reality of who he'd married, while also witnessing the complete collapse of whatever affection might have existed between them.
Dorothy's will had accomplished exactly what she'd intended, forcing everyone to reveal their true priorities and values without any possibility of pretense or self-deception. "You know what the worst part is?" Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced shock. "Mom spent 2 years dying slowly, and you visited exactly 3 times. 3 times in 24 months, but you expect to inherit her treasures like you were a devoted daughter-in-law who couldn't bear to leave her side." "I had responsibilities in San Francisco, my career, our life, important commitments that couldn't be postponed every time your mother had a bad day." "She didn't have bad days, Jessica. She had cancer. She was fighting for her life while you were building your resume and planning how to spend her money after she lost that fight." The accusations were flying now, years of suppressed resentment and unacknowledged truth erupting in my living room where Dorothy had spent her final months hoping her son would visit more often and her daughter-in-law would learn to see beyond dollar signs. Jessica turned to me with an expression that mixed desperation with calculation, probably recognizing that Michael was beyond her influence, but thinking I might be more vulnerable to emotional manipulation. "Harold, you know I loved Dorothy. Maybe I didn't express it the way she expected, but I cared about her in my own way. Those comments at the memorial service, I was grieving too, just processing loss differently than other people do." Processing loss by discussing antique values and inheritance timelines? Expressing love by suggesting the sale of irreplaceable family heirlooms? Showing care by avoiding a dying woman's bedside for 2 years while planning how to benefit from her death? Jessica's definition of love bore no resemblance to anything Dorothy or I would have recognized. "Dorothy understood exactly how you processed loss," I said. "She watched you for 5 years, Jessica. She listened to your suggestions about selling her belongings, noticed your impatience with her stories, observed your excitement about inheritance possibilities. Nothing she wrote in that letter was speculation or assumption. It was documentation." "This is about money, isn't it?" Jessica's voice took on a wheedling tone. "Harold, you don't need all of Dorothy's estate. You're comfortable. You own the house outright. You have your retirement income. Michael and I are just starting our lives together. We have student loans, career expenses, plans for children who will need college funds."
student loans, and career expenses that could be managed on Michael's six-figure salary if Jessica learned to live within their actual means rather than the inflated lifestyle she'd expected Dorothy's death to fund. But even now, facing complete rejection, she was still trying to negotiate, still believing that everyone else's priorities could be rearranged to benefit her personal financial planning. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't need Dorothy's estate to survive, but I earned it through 47 years of partnership, through caring for her during her illness, through being present when presence mattered. You earned exactly what Dorothy left you, which was a lesson in the difference between loving someone and coveting their possessions." Michael moved toward his wife with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager dealing with bullies at school, determined and slightly dangerous in the way of normally gentle people who'd been pushed too far. "Pack your things, Jessica. We're getting a divorce." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that reached every corner. Jessica's mouth fell open, her calculated composure finally cracking completely as she realized that losing Dorothy's inheritance might be the least of her problems. "You can't be serious. Michael, you're emotional right now. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly about what this means for our future." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Mom was right about you, Jessica. She saw what I refused to see because I didn't want to admit I'd made such a terrible mistake in judgment."
What mistake? Marrying someone who was practical about money instead of sentimental about worthless objects? Choosing a partner who thought about our future instead of wallowing in the past? Marrying someone who called my mother finally gone at her memorial service. Someone who spent 2 years avoiding a cancer patient because dying people were inconvenient. Someone who looked at my family's history and saw dollar signs instead of love. Jessica's face cycled through several expressions as she processed the reality that her marriage was dissolving along with her inheritance prospects. The financial security she'd been counting on, the lifestyle upgrades she'd planned, the comfortable future built on Dorothy's death were all evaporating simultaneously. "Fine," she said finally, her voice turning cold and brittle. "Keep your precious antiques and your sentimental attachments, but don't expect me to pretend this is about love or family values. This is about money, pure and simple. Harold wanted to keep everything for himself, so he poisoned Dorothy against me, and now you're choosing his lies over your own wife." The accusations were desperate and pathetic, but also revealing of how completely Jessica misunderstood the relationships she'd been trying to manipulate. She genuinely believed that families operated like business partnerships, where loyalty could be purchased and affection could be negotiated through financial transactions. "Nobody poisoned Dorothy against you," I said. "You did that yourself, with 5 years of showing her exactly who you are and what you value. My wife was a librarian, Jessica. She spent 40 years reading people's character like books, and yours was an easy story to understand." Michael walked to the door and held it open, his gesture unmistakably final. "Go back to San Francisco, Jessica. File for divorce. Take half of what we accumulated together and build whatever life you want with someone who shares your values. But you're done manipulating my family." Jessica stood there for a moment longer, her expression shifting between rage and disbelief as she realized that her 5-year investment in strategic family relationships had not only failed to pay dividends, but had actually cost her everything she'd been trying to secure. "You'll regret this," she said, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. "Both of you. When you're sitting alone in this house full of dusty old junk, wondering why you chose dead people's memories over living people's needs, you'll realize what a mistake this was." She paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the antiques she'd expected to inherit and the family she'd never bothered to love. Dorothy won, didn't she? Even dead, she managed to destroy my marriage and steal my future.
I hope you're all happy with what that vindictive old woman accomplished." The door slammed behind her, with enough force to rattle Dorothy's china cabinet, and then the house fell silent. Except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Dorothy had inherited from her own grandmother decades ago. Michael stood in the sudden quiet, looking older and sadder, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't see what Mom saw. Sorry I let Jessica treat her that way. Sorry I chose my wife over my family when it mattered most." "You chose correctly in the end," I replied. "That's what Dorothy wanted, for you to have the courage to see the truth when it became impossible to ignore." Through the front window, we watched Jessica climb into her rental car and drive away from our quiet Portland street, heading back to whatever life awaited her in San Francisco. She'd arrived there with nothing but her own resources and the hard lesson that some inheritances have to be earned through love rather than claimed through marriage. Dorothy's final gift to our family wasn't the money or antiques she'd distributed so carefully. It was the truth she'd forced us all to confront about what really mattered and who really cared. Some lessons, as she'd always known, could only be learned the hard way. 6 months later, I stood in Dorothy's rose garden with a cup of morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint Portland's sky in shades of gold and pink that she would have loved. The roses were blooming more magnificently than ever, as if her absence had freed them to reach their full potential without the careful constraints of human expectation. Michael had moved back to Portland 3 months ago, taking a position with a local marketing firm that paid less than his San Francisco job, but allowed him to rebuild the relationship he'd neglected for too long. He'd rented a small apartment in the Hawthorne district, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to maintain his independence as he navigated his new life as a divorced man. The divorce proceedings had been swift and surprisingly clean. Jessica had taken her half of their shared assets and returned to San Francisco without attempting to contest Dorothy's will or pursue any further claims against our family. She'd remarried within 4 months to a tech executive she'd met through work, suggesting that her capacity for strategic relationship building remained intact, even after her Portland failure. "Morning, Dad," Michael called from the back door, carrying 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast he'd prepared in Dorothy's kitchen. This had become our Sunday routine, sharing breakfast in the garden while discussing everything from current events to memories of his childhood when Dorothy would read to him under the old oak tree. "Beautiful morning," I replied, accepting the plate and settling into the wooden bench Dorothy and I had built together 15 years ago. "Your mother always said Sunday mornings in the garden felt like prayers made visible." Michael smiled at the memory, his expression carrying none of the guilt or tension that had characterized his visits during Dorothy's illness. The weight of living with Jessica's disapproval had lifted from his shoulders, allowing him to rediscover the gentle humor and genuine warmth that had made Dorothy so proud of the man he'd become. "I've been thinking about something," he said, cutting his eggs with deliberate precision. "That $25,000 Mom left me, I want to use it to establish a scholarship fund at Portland State, specifically for first-generation college students studying education." The idea was pure Dorothy, helping future teachers who understood the transformative power of learning because they'd experienced it themselves. She would have been delighted that Michael had found a way to honor her profession while extending her legacy to students she'd never meet but would have loved to teach. "She would approve of that completely," I said. "What made you think of it?" I kept reading her letter, the one Margaret read at the will ceremony, the part about choosing love over convenience in all my relationships. I realized I'd been choosing convenience for years, not just with Jessica, but with you and Mom, with my career, with everything important. Michael had indeed been rereading Dorothy's letter, carrying it in his wallet like a roadmap for rebuilding his character according to principles he'd temporarily abandoned. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been steady and genuine,
the kind of gradual change Dorothy had always believed was more lasting than dramatic conversions. "Your mother never doubted that you'd find your way back to what mattered," I assured him. "She just worried about how much you'd have to lose before you recognized what was worth keeping." Frank Rodriguez joined us for breakfast most Sundays now, bringing his carpenter's wisdom and 4 decades of friendship to conversations that ranged from practical home maintenance to philosophical discussions about aging, loss, and the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerged from difficult transitions. "Harold's been thinking about selling the house," Frank announced as he helped himself to coffee from the thermos Michael had brought outside. "Moving somewhere smaller, maybe one of those retirement communities with organized activities and medical support."
This was true, though I hadn't yet made any firm decisions. The Craftsman house held 47 years of memories, but it also required maintenance that was becoming more challenging as I aged. Dorothy and I had always planned to downsize eventually, discussing condominiums or senior living options that would free us from yard work and home repairs. "What do you think, Michael?" I asked. "Would you be comfortable with me selling the house where you grew up?" Michael considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would influence a decision that couldn't be easily reversed. When he spoke, his response carried the measured thoughtfulness that reminded me of Dorothy at her wisest moments. "I think Mom would want you to live wherever you'd be happiest and safest. The house is just a building, Dad. The family lives in the relationships we choose to maintain, not in the address where we happen to sleep." The wisdom in his answer pleased me enormously. Michael was learning to distinguish between sentiment and sentimentality, understanding that honoring Dorothy's memory didn't require preserving every physical reminder of their shared life. Patricia and David had become regular fixtures at our Sunday gatherings, bringing Dorothy's sister's practical energy and her nephew's architectural expertise to discussions about home maintenance and future planning. The china set Dorothy had left Patricia graced our table every week, connecting past and present through the simple ritual of sharing meals on dishes that had survived immigration, depression, and decades of careful preservation. "I've been researching some retirement communities," Patricia mentioned, spreading brochures across the picnic table we'd inherited from Dorothy's teaching supplies. "There's one in Beaverton with a library and workshop spaces where you could volunteer, maybe help with literacy programs like Dorothy used to do." The suggestion appealed to me more than I'd expected. Dorothy had always found purpose in helping others discover the joy of reading, and continuing that work might provide structure and meaning to retirement years that sometimes felt aimless without her partnership. "I'd like to visit a few places," I decided. Maybe Michael could help me evaluate the options, bring his marketing perspective to what's essentially a major life purchase. Michael nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased to be included in important family decisions, rather than excluded from them as Jessica had preferred. The restoration of trust between us had been gradual but complete, built on honest conversations and shared commitment to honoring Dorothy's values and our daily choices. David's daughters had become frequent visitors too, drawn to the grandfather figure I'd become and curious about family stories that connected them to Dorothy's legacy. They helped me tend the rose garden, learning the names of varieties Dorothy had researched and planted with characteristic thoroughness. "Grandpa Harry tells the best stories about Great-Aunt Dorothy," 8-year-old Emma announced during one recent visit, her small hands carefully watering the climbing roses Dorothy had trained along our back fence. "He says she knew every book in the library and could find the perfect story for anyone who needed one." These moments of intergenerational connection felt like Dorothy's presence made manifest, her love extending forward through relationships that would outlast any material inheritance. The children would carry her stories into futures she couldn't imagine, keeping her memory alive in ways that transcended monetary bequests or legal documents. The evening news often featured stories about family conflicts over inheritance, bitter disputes that destroyed relationships and turned death into opportunity for greed and manipulation. I thought about Jessica sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from her encounter with Dorothy's final judgment, or if she'd simply moved on to new targets for her strategic relationship building.
Michael seemed to harbor no bitterness toward his ex-wife, speaking of their marriage as a learning experience that had taught him valuable lessons about the difference between compatibility and genuine partnership. He'd begun dating a teacher he'd met through volunteer work at a local literacy program, someone who shared Dorothy's passion for education and her belief in the transformative power of patient encouragement. "Sarah reminds me of Mom in some ways," he'd mentioned recently, "not physically, but in her approach to people. She sees potential in everyone she meets, believes that given enough support and encouragement, anyone can learn to love reading." The comparison pleased me because it suggested Michael was choosing partners based on character rather than convenience, seeking qualities that aligned with family values rather than personal advancement. Dorothy would have approved of someone who shared her professional passion and her fundamental optimism about human nature. As autumn approached, I had begun making concrete plans for the transition Patricia had suggested. The retirement community in Beaverton offered the perfect combination of independence and support, with opportunities to volunteer at their library and participate in activities that would keep both mind and body engaged. Michael would help coordinate the estate sale that would disperse 47 years of accumulated possessions to people who would value them appropriately. Dorothy's books would go to teachers and students, her antiques to collectors who appreciated their history, her gardening tools to neighbors who would use them to create beauty in their own yards. The process felt like completing Dorothy's work rather than erasing it, ensuring that objects she'd loved would continue serving purposes that aligned with her values. Even in letting go, we were honoring her belief that things existed to serve people, not the other way around. Frank had offered to oversee the house renovations that would prepare it for sale, his carpenter's eye identifying improvements that would honor Dorothy's aesthetic while appealing to modern buyers. The new owners would inherit her rose garden and the fruit trees she planted, along with the quiet beauty she'd cultivated through decades of patient attention. Standing in that garden on a perfect October morning, surrounded by family and friends who'd chosen to be present for both sorrow and joy, I felt Dorothy's legacy taking its intended form, not as objects to be inherited or money to be distributed, but as relationships deepened through shared commitment to love over convenience, character over calculation. Jessica had been wrong about many things, but perhaps most fundamentally about the nature of inheritance itself. Dorothy's greatest bequest hadn't been material at all, but rather the example of how to live with integrity, how to love without condition, and how to leave the world better than you found it through countless small acts of genuine care. The roses would bloom again next spring and the spring after that, carrying forward the beauty Dorothy had planted with her own hands. Her books would inspire new readers, her stories would guide future decisions, and her love would continue shaping lives she'd never had the chance to touch directly. That was the inheritance that truly mattered, the wealth that multiplied when shared, and grew stronger with each generation that chose to preserve it. Jessica could keep her disappointment and her calculations. The rest of us had received something far more valuable than money could ever buy.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.